Dr. Shoshana Zuboff, author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, and Professor Emerita, Harvard Business School, joins us for a conversation which begins where her book ends, and more precisely, in the time after Facebook's so-called Supreme Court punted its decision about the fate of the former president's Facebook account, Donald Trump. Dr. Zuboff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nikki. It's a pleasure.
Moments after Facebook's oversight board dropped its decision on Trump, you used the allegory of a Charlie Chaplin scene where we're all chasing each other's tail around the rim of a donut and not finding what we're looking for because it was in the hole, you said, and it's gone. So how does the reclaiming begin? How should we decide the rules of the road? And I'm beginning here because I think the problem is pretty well defined. Over to you, Dr. Zuboff.
The central point of that metaphor that I used the morning that we discovered the situation at Facebook, I talked about the corporation, Facebook, which of course, in every important way, can be reduced to Mr. Zuckerberg himself because he does exercise essentially total control over what that company does. And I pictured Mr. Zuckerberg chasing this so-called oversight board while they're chasing him, and that idea of, each of them chasing each other around the rim of a donut. If you know how donuts are shaped, they are empty in the middle. That's the donut hole. And my point is that Facebook failed to act effectively with respect to Mr. Trump, of course, but also with respect to the larger landscape of disinformation generated by increasingly extremist right-wing networks. Some of them run professionally, some of them formal or informal allies of Trump and his whole hierarchy of vassals. And under cover of political advertising and under cover of what I would describe as a crackpot version of the First Amendment, that the right to free speech that Mr. Zuckerberg used to as a kind of camouflage for his actions. The bottom line is that for years, and especially in that year running up to the 2020 presidential election, Facebook's actions were entirely ineffective, and that was intentional. Mr. Zuckerberg decided to let all of this whole body of lies and extremism flourish on his property. And this so-called oversight board, appointed by and funded by Mr. Zuckerberg, funded by the corporation, was a way of kind of passing the buck, a way of performing as if there was a real effort at responsible behavior, when in fact the so-called oversight board has very little power, very narrow range of decision-making, and absolutely no enforcement capability. So outside the very narrow range of decision-making, they can make policy recommendations that Mr. Zuckerberg is free to ignore. So the whole thing is a kind of theatrical performance, as if this was a responsible corporation. In the end, what this fiasco reveals is that all of the solution set, all the ways that we must really come to grips with the problem of the social upheaval that is produced when corrupt information overwhelms the global information bloodstream. That whole solution set is in the hole of the donut, and that's where democracy is. That's where the rule of law is. That's where public law is. That's where the only durable solutions are going to come from the politics of citizens and lawmakers moving together. And what happens is when you look at this hole, this void, the first thing that's obvious is that the liberal democracies of the world have so far failed to construct a coherent vision of what a digital and democratic society would look like, what a digital and democratic future would look like. And there's a sharp contrast here with, for example, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese government has been extremely intentional about a vision, design, deployment, application of digital technologies in ways that advance their form of authoritarian government. And this vision is and strategies, and technologies, and applications. This is all central to their domestic as well as their foreign policy. But when we look across the liberal democracies of the world, we have nothing comparable. We have left this void, and surveillance capitalism, corporations like Facebook have filled this void. So here we have an unprecedented global communications infrastructure that involves billions of people around the world. And as democratic societies, we have never even had the discussion of what should be the parameters of such a new capability. When the telephone system was invented, and I'll speak for a moment, if I may, from the point of view of just a tiny bit of American business history. The point is, when we look at what happened inside that system, there were many points in American law where we had to come to a reckoning with telephone communications. And so, for example, it was deemed that if the government tried to listen in on communications without a warrant, condoned by the courts and so forth, that this would be regarded as a violation of human rights. And it would have both chilling effects on free speech and also, which is the First Amendment, but also risked violating Fourth Amendment rights, which are the rights to be protected from unwarranted search and seizure by the government. And of course, that has everything to do with, a larger public commitment to privacy and so forth. So, we had these kinds of debates at various stages, and the telephone system became a highly regulated system, ultimately treated as a public utility, even though it was owned and operated by a private corporation, AT&T. Nothing of the sort has happened in this century vis-a-vis the internet, speaking most generally, and certainly vis-a-vis social media, speaking, a bit more narrowly. So this has left a void where law must be. We can draw lessons from the last century and how we moved through the challenges of industrialization. We began with identifying rights. Those rights were embedded in large legislative frameworks. And then we didn't just say that, who's ever in power in America, for example, who's ever in the White House, or, whoever has the majority in the legislatures or the parliaments, gets to govern and oversee these new rights and laws. Instead, what we did was we set up specific institutions with detailed public law that holds them accountable to public transparency and holds them accountable to citizens and to lawmakers and to democratic processes. So we created institutions, for example, like the Federal Reserve. Well, the Federal Reserve must operate according to certain standards that are transparent to the public, that are contestable, and are repairable when they violate those rules. And the way the Federal Reserve operates is distinct from whoever is inhabiting the White House at any given moment, or what political party has a majority in Congress. So these are public institutions defined by democratic governance, defined by the rule of law, defined by transparency and public accountability. And so this is this third institutional territory. The idea is not to give all the authority and power to the employers and to capital itself, to the business owners and their interests, but neither do we just give all of that authority and power to the current politician who sits at the top of the hierarchy.
Dr. Zuboff.
Yes, of course, please.
The hole in the donut is filled with many questions like the ones you framed, which is who decides. And that hole is also filled with so many congressional testimonies. I mean, we almost know what they're going to say, right? It's been filled with the 26 words in Section 230, which gives immunity for the crackpot version of free speech to fill that hole, right? So some countries, like Australia, for instance, very recently passed the News Bargaining Code. These are all tiny donuts or tiny pieces of dough that can eventually or maybe fill that hole. India passed a digital media ethics rules, not code, not law, but rules. So what are those structures that need to be put in place quickly? Because like Lawrence Tribe responded to you right at the end, he said, we don't have a lot of time to do this. So what are those mini or micro structures that must be created to fill that hole?
We need to understand where we want to get to, and then we need to understand the short and medium term strategies and tactics, legislatively, politically, that will help us get there. And so you're absolutely right, Nikki. I'm starting out by identifying the goal state, and then what I do in my own thinking is kind of work backward from there and say what it's very different to approach the legislative challenge if you're just sort of going opportunistically, moving from crisis to crisis. Then if you have a sense of the larger chessboard and where it is that you want to end up, and so that's what I'm describing. And I'll just say a couple more things about that, and then I will revert to your question and how we begin.
Yeah, sure.
Is that fair?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I wanted to say about this began with, we've said two things so far. The first thing we've said is that the problems that we're facing, including the wholesale destruction of privacy, but also the concentrations, not just of economic power, but of knowledge and the unique kind of power that accrues to this unprecedented scale of knowledge about people. When we talk about the computational factory where predictions of human behavior are created that are then sold in futures markets, it's useful for people to hear that based on leaked documents, we know that, for example, Facebook's computational hub, its factory, what it calls its AI backbone, ingests, that's its word, trillions of data points every single day and produces 6 million predictions of human behavior every second. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about. And of those trillions of data points, only a very small fraction of those are what we knowingly give the companies. The vast majority of that is what they secretly take through apps, through devices, through sensors, through the way they track and monitor us in ways that are all carefully engineered to keep us in ignorance, surveillance. So we're talking about an unprecedented situation with unprecedented harms. And so the first thing is all of this has to get addressed by through politics, by democracy. The shorthand for this is that the digital has to live in democracy's house. There is no such thing as cyberspace. There is no world that is somehow, special, exceptional, exempt from the charters of rights and laws that we live by in our societies. All of our rights and laws have to adhere every place, in every domain, in every business sector. There is no such thing as cyberspace. Cyberspace is simply machines, data, capital, and people. So that's number one, and we've talked about that. Number two is we need a new generation of human rights that focus on epistemic rights. And you're absolutely correct. I summarize this idea of epistemic rights that, of course, have to do with knowledge and knowing with three essential questions, which are easy to carry with you in your back pocket. Who knows? Who decides who knows? And who decides who knows? These are the questions of, first, distribution of knowledge. Second, the authority over that distribution. Who decides who knows? Finally, the power from which that authority derives. Who decides who decides? Knowledge, authority, and power. And this is what we have to reckon with new charters of epistemic rights. Okay, and now we move on to the third principle, and that is that we're facing a set of challenges, of violations that we've never faced before. They're unprecedented because they depend entirely on the digital. And this is the first century in which we've experienced digital. So we're just figuring out what its capabilities are and what those capabilities can be turned into, but we don't yet have the bodies of laws that are purpose-built for the harms that we face, beginning with the entire supply system of surveillance capitalism, which is what we've just been talking about, the unilateral, secret extraction of behavioral data from our lives. This is something that began in secret, grew in secret. We never agreed to it, and there is almost no law to contain it. And yet it is fundamentally illegitimate. If you describe this process to any child, you say, hey, somebody took something from me without asking. Now they're selling it and they're using it to make money for themselves. What should I do? And that child will say, they stole something from you. You should call the police. And we see these reactions all the time when we hear what children and teenagers have to say when they learn about the systems that are spying on them and taking information about them and how that information is being used. So the point is that this is theft. And this first fundamental act of unilateral extraction from our lives is essentially theft. It's deeply illegitimate. And of course, without that, the whole rest of the edifice crumbles. And so when we talk about objectives in the larger chessboard, we need to be able to confront extraction head on. And we need to have laws that make this kind of secret extraction illegal, simply criminalize it. And at the other end, we started with the supply chain, how they get these data in the first place. At the other end, we have the markets that trade in human futures that provide the financial incentives for this massive scale extraction. So the very first markets that trade in human futures are targeted online advertising. Google invented the first globally successful prediction product, and that was the click-through rate. And that was the basis for online targeted advertising, which is based on advertisers bidding on predictions of what ads will click on and the likelihood will click through to their websites and buy their wares or services. So we can also go, so we've started the supply end, we can also go to the demand side, and we can say, look, in the demand side, we are simply going to outlaw markets that commodify human behavior and trade in of our behavior, because we can see that those markets lead to predictably dangerous and anti-democratic consequences. In the middle, we have operations. Mm-hmm. All the operations of data analysis and targeting, which are designed to increase engagement, which increases extraction, which drives predictions, which drives these markets. So all of these pieces are connected. And in the middle there, what we want to be able to say is that operations are tied to society. So data collection operations are tied to fundamental rights, and data application operations are tied to the public interest. So now all of this has migrated, as we said earlier, to democracy house, not to be tossed around by whoever happens to be in power, but under laws that stand independently and govern these kinds of procedures. Now, how do we move toward there, and how how difficult will that be? Well, most people, will listen to what we've been talking about and be a little bit surprised because many people have concluded that, in fact, the world that we're living in is inevitable. Too many people in our world right now have come to the conclusion that this is somehow inevitable.
Or they like it, or they don't mind. That happens too, right?
Well, yes, although I think in the vast majority of cases, people say they don't mind because they don't know. Research shows, and this goes back really to the early 2000s, that people say they don't mind, and then when they are actually kind of let in on the secret of how they are being tracked, monitored, what is the data that's being pulled, it's not just what you told Facebook, it's not just what you told Google, it's whether you use exclamation points or bullet points. It's whether you say, I'll meet you at 7:45 or I'll meet you this evening. It's not just your face to ID you, but it is your face to analyze the microexpressions produced by the hundreds of muscles in your face. Microexpressions predict emotions. Emotions are the best predictors here. So Amazon facial recognition, for example, now brags that in addition to being able to identify if you're sad, if you're happy, if you're angry, if you're confused, if you're bored, it can also now identify your fear, if you're scared. And these things are object competition among surveillance capitalists because these are the predictive signals, not where you're walking, but the stoop of your shoulders, the pace of your walking, your gait, and so forth. These are the predictive signals that are being lifted from our behavior at every turn. And I'm only just scratching the surface here. I could keep listing many, many things, but that would take up too much time. So people think it's inevitable. The companies have preached to us for the last 20 years that we shouldn't complain because all of these effects that I'm describing are simply consequences of digital technology. Digital technology is, so great and it's going to teach us so much and it's going to improve our lives and our world. And we just have to swallow this pill because all of these things are somehow an outgrowth of technology. Nothing could be further from the truth. For the last 2 decades, it's been difficult to get lawmakers' attention, and I would say, of course, the big exception here has been the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in Europe. But GDPR, has, kind of fallen into the classic trap, focusing on the downstream issues of data and how data is managed. How is it protected? Is it accessible? Is it portable? And so forth. But when we're talking about illegitimate extraction, every conversation about data is already a conversation that has lost the war. It's fighting a downstream battle, but it's already lost the war because once you're arguing about legal contracts over data, then you have lost the war about the illegitimacy of itself, because a lot of the data that we're arguing about shouldn't exist in the first place unless individuals have decided that it should exist, or unless democracy, as in the case, for example, of public health authorities, have decided that it should exist with the full accountability and transparency and legal protections and rights that accrue to citizens. So we are already beginning to see some of those micro short-term shifts. The strategies and the tactics put into place that begin to change the game. So we see this first of all in Europe. The EU Parliament right now has in front of it two major pieces of legislation that were developed by the European Commission over the past couple of years. One of these is called the Digital Services Act. One of these is called the Markets Act. And both of these, and especially taken together, each one of them, and of course taken together, in the work. I picture the huge Titanic pointed toward an iceberg. And the first thing we have to do is shift the trajectory of this big boat. And when you look at these two regulatory proposals, they do that very, very well. They shift the direction of the big boat. So we're no longer heading toward the anti-democratic iceberg of surveillance capitalism. The Digital Services Act, for example, provides real audit authority to democratic governments so that they can create institutions. Each country can create institutions. The union can create institutions, and these institutions have actual oversight authorities so that they can be inside companies, they can be look at algorithms, they can look at algorithmic modeling and production, and they can look at algorithmic consequences, and they can detect, for example, bias. They can detect the algorithms that are engineered to maximize engagement by disseminating and amplifying the most inflammatory, deviant, toxic content, which has proven to be the fastest route to increasing engagement and therefore increasing extraction. And by giving the public through these new institutional setups and representatives of democratic government audit authority, you now change the criteria, because no longer can these operations simply be driven by the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism. Instead now, as is stated in the Digital Services Act, they have to be accountable first and foremost to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and to the varieties of laws that have been institutionalized in Europe to uphold those rights. So, and then when we look at the Digital Markets Act, one of the very important things that does is create preemptive authority so that when you see a monopoly being developed, or when you see anti-competitive practices being developed, or when you see algorithmic harms, gathering at scale, you can intervene preemptively, because of course, the problem has been that our regulations take a long time to figure out through appropriately slow. Slow is good in democracy, and democracy is slower than private capital, which can do anything it wants, especially in a company like Facebook or Google, where the power structure is so narrow. And so now we have, some legal basis for, again, evening the playing field between the companies and the regulators, so that you see these patterns developing and you can intervene preemptively to stop those harmful behaviors. And this finally gives a democracy a chance to balance scales. And then, of course, we've seen just at the end of April, just a few weeks ago, the European Commission issuing a whole new vision for artificial intelligence and principles of accountability for artificial intelligence that the first time hold this massive new technological breakthrough, hold it accountable to democratic values and principles. And this is just, so now we're coming full circle, Nikki, to the hole in the donut, which is where the solution set needs to be. And we are seeing in Europe very intelligent, densely reasoned, compelling efforts to begin to fill that hole. And as we talked about before, these proposals are not going to take us all the way to the goalposts. But when we talk about strategic legislative action, they begin to do the work of shifting the authority, shifting the power back to the people, back to the rule of public law. And once we do that, then we've created a foundation where we build now, in the course of this decade, to fundamentally challenging extraction, to fundamentally challenging the commodification of human behavior as a major source of revenue for the richest companies on earth. Think about it.
Yeah.
And then, Nikki, the United States, as I know you are well aware, has been really the laggard in this discussion. It has been captured by the companies. It has been captured by the self-regulatory ideology. This has a lot to do with neoliberalism and all of that. But the point now is that we are seeing shifts in America. American lawmakers are waking up to this discussion. And as you mentioned earlier, for a few years now, certainly since the Cambridge Analytica hearings in 2018 in the American Congress, we've been embarrassed by our lawmakers. And they were, no match to interview the tech executives, and they clearly didn't understand what was going on. And they were still wondering how to send an email, it seemed, back in 2018.
And then they all watched Social Dilemma.
And then they watched Social Dilemma, and I'm proud to say many of them read my book. And they watched The Great Hack. And the point is that if you look at the congressional hearings on disinformation and social media that were held on March 24th of this year, it's chalk and cheese. It's a new world.
In fact, during that hearing, which you mentioned, I remember very clearly, I watched all of it. It was the first time that lawmakers pushed back specifically on what it's doing to teenagers, adolescents, young people. A lot of what you said comes back to the right to sanctuary, as you say. And I want to just leave this for our audience, if they're interested. It's a quote from chapter 17. Refuge and prospect are opposites. Refuge is small and dark. Prospect is expansive and bright. We need them both, and we need them together. Grant Hildebrand, Finding a Good Home, Origins of Architectural Pleasure. And
That's a very good point. And what you saw in those congressional hearings was that the Democrats were coming down hard on the economic model, but the Republicans were also coming down hard
correct.
on the tech executives. And typically the thread that connected the Republican opposition was the harms to children. About everyone, no matter what their specific political persuasion, about everyone can agree that the harms being visited on our children are intolerable, and that we must have law to control this. And this, interestingly, kind of tying up to the beginning of our discussion, in the industrial age, the first rights that were won really were the child labor rights. The first battles that were fought by progressives, fought and won, were the battles over child labor, and the recognition that child labor had to be addressed. In my country, the recognition that child labor had to be addressed not just on a state basis, but on a national basis. Otherwise, it couldn't be effective. And then once child labor laws were accepted and we'd broken that barrier of the total authority of the employers, then the workers' rights and consumers' rights followed. This is one of those spaces where there will be a lot of convergence of force to change, for sure. Ultimately, we are talking about who knows, who decides who knows, who decides who decides. We're talking about epistemic rights. The right to have the sanctuary of my experience, sanctuary of my life, sanctuary of my home, sanctuary in all the spaces where I live. This fundamentally is a expression of the epistemic disequilibrium that we have that we are facing now. The revolutionary takeover of epistemic rights that has occurred at the hands of surveillance capitalism. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zuboff. It's
you are very
so
welcome,
kind
Nikki.
of you.